So, good evening. I want to begin tonight's session by acknowledging whose land historically these proceedings are taking place upon, land where many Indigenous peoples have lived, the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, as well as the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, Seneca, and Haudenosaunee peoples. We want to acknowledge our duty of stewardship towards the land and the privilege that we have, all of us, to work on this land. My name is Michael Valpy. I'm a Senior Fellow of Massey College. Principal Nathalie Desrosiers has asked me, and it's a request I'm very pleased to fulfill, to moderate tonight's discussion by two outstanding journalists, Maria Angelita Ressa from the Philippines, co-awarded the 2021 Nobel Peace Prize with Russian journalist Dmitry Muratov for their efforts, in the words of the citation, quotes, to safeguard freedom of expression, which is a precondition for democracy and lasting peace. And Maria, if you're there, will you come out and join us?
I'm here.
Good. And Maria, if I can call you by your first name, yes, will be in conversation with Massey College's Omayra Issa, this year's William Southam Fellow from CBC Radio Canada, who, as you'll hear in a moment, has had a dazzling career. They both have had dazzling careers with Canada's national broadcaster from one end of the country to the other. And I want to introduce Omayra's parents, who are here from Niger, Abdoulaye Issa and Issa Issa, and her brother, good. And her brother Malik, who is now living in Montreal and just graduated from university. Good. So, welcome to you all. We have an hour and a half. The evening will be in the hands of Maria and Omayra for the first hour and 15 minutes. And then I will open up the last 15 minutes for questions, for oral questions. And just before we get going with longer introductions, I want finally to acknowledge the presence of Ontario's Lieutenant Governor, Her Honor Elizabeth Dowdeswell, and Thomas Schultz, who is Consul General in Toronto for the Federal Republic of Germany. Welcome to you both. For those of you in the audience tonight who are or who have been journalists, we stand truly in awe of Maria and her accomplishments. And we have to acknowledge that we walk in your shadow. You have given new definition to the phrase, a meteoric rise in career. Maria arrived in the US at age 10. As she explained it, I landed in New Jersey where I could barely speak English, and I had to figure out what a short brown kid was going to do in this big white world. A few years later, the short brown kid graduated cum laude from Princeton with a degree in English, theater, and dance, and was awarded a Fulbright Fellowship to study political theater at the University of the Philippines, where she also taught several journalism courses. Excuse me. Her first job was at government station PTV4. She then served, and this is where the meteoric rise comes in, she then served as CNN's bureau chief in Manila until 1995, then ran CNN's Jakarta bureau from 1995 to 2005, then became CNN's lead investigative reporter in Asia, specializing in investigating terrorist networks. She became an author in residence at the International Center for Political Violence and Terrorism Research at Singapore's Nanyang Technological University. She's a fellow at the Initiative on the Digital Economy at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and is a 2021 Joan Shorenstein Fellow at the Shorenstein Center on Media Politics and Public Policy, and Hauser Leader at the Center for Public Leadership at Harvard Kennedy School. She's the author of 2 books on the rise of terrorism in Southeast Asia, Seeds of Terror, an eyewitness account of Al-Qaeda's rise, and From Bin Laden to Facebook, 10 Days of Abduction, 10 Days of Terrorism. In 2012, 10 years ago, she established the independent online news site Rappler, of which she is executive editor and chief executive officer. For the past 6 years, Rappler has come under relentless attack from the government of Rodrigo Duterte, which it has accused of horrendous human rights abuses, primarily in connection with the government's so-called war on drugs, and for running a troll army, pushing out fake news stories on social media platforms. The government, in turn, has jailed Maria, suspended Rappler's business license, charged her with libel and other government offenses, culminating with a charge of violating the Philippines law on cybercrime, which was passed after the publication of an alleged Rappler libelous article. The National Union of Journalists of the Philippines has referred to her treatment as, quote, a shameless act of persecution by a bully government, unquote. And the newly elected government of Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos is continuing the attack on Maria and Rappler. Within the last few days, as some of you may have read, the Philippines Court of Appeal has refused to reconsider her conviction for cyber libel, leaving her to face imprisonment from being between 6 months and 6 years. I think her conviction also has a message for us in Canada, apart from democracy and the role of media in defending democracy, because her conviction speaks to concerns we might have in Canada for criminal laws regulating cyber journalism, looking at how social media postings have been abused, especially in the United States. We're inclined to enthusiastically support laws for their regulation. But what Maria Ressa's case demonstrates is that they can also be used abusively. In any event, with imprisonment hanging over her head, we're exceedingly fortunate to have that Maria has been allowed to come to Canada. She will be in conversation this evening with the exceptionally talented and accomplished Massey Williams Southam Journalism Fellow Omayra Issa, who for nearly a decade has been building a remarkable career, more meteoric rise, a remarkable career in CBC Radio Canada, based in Saskatchewan, and reporting across Western Canada and from Ottawa. She works in both of Canada's official languages, as well as speaking fluent Spanish, Hausa, and Zarma. She has reported on COVID-19, the justice system, immigration, race, climate change, and reconciliation with Canada's Indigenous communities. She's produced and anchored Saskatchewan's 6 o'clock provincial newscast and worked as a political analyst, commentator, and reporter for the province's Radio-Canada programs. She has been appointed to a committee tasked with reviewing CBC's journalistic standards and practices through diversity and inclusion. Most recently, she created, produced, and led CBC's multi-platform series, Black on the Prairies, and led a team creating a teacher's guide for the series. Her work has won accolades, but I sadly add also exposed her to a torrent of racism and online hate. She gave the prestigious 2022 Kesterton Lecture in Journalism at the University of Carleton a few weeks ago, where she talked about the online harassment of Canadian journalists and the relationship between open discourse and democracy. And with her refreshing outlook and passion, her voice is helping guide national conversations around inclusion and diversity in newsrooms and efforts to combat hate and harassment against journalists online. With stories and actions, Omayra is pushing forward improvements that speak to the foundations of journalism in Canada. So we're proud to have you both. And Omayra, I'll turn the conversation over to you.
Thank you so much, Michael. Good evening, everyone. Aren't we so happy to have Maria with us? So, Maria, every day you live with the fear, the threat of spending the rest of your life in prison in the Philippines. How are you doing?
You have to laugh, right? That's how you cope. I mean, it's been 6 years. So first of all, thank you for coming. I mean, you know, you care about it, and to see so many familiar faces in the audience, you must be tired of me by now, Lieutenant General. But you know, it is fantastic to be here. This is my last court-approved travel, which means I don't know whether I can leave the Philippines again, since my case is now, one of the 7 cases is now elevated to the Supreme Court. I think about it like pollution. You know, it's like I don't really have a choice, right? But all of this, like the attacks you get for reporting, is just meant to pound you to silence. So it starts on social media, and then the law was weaponized against us. And there are times that are bad, but in general, you know, I think depending on what's happening, I live a breaking news life. Highs and lows. It's a roller coaster, and I try very hard to go from really, really highs, like the Nobel. Who thinks that, right? Like, hello, you know, I still am doing the scream, and then, oh, I could go to jail, you know, and oh, I need to have security. So these lows and highs, I try to live in the middle to continue working, and that actually works. So I get used to the pollution, and our goal in Rappler is to make sure that this kind of Damocles sword that the government is hanging over us doesn't prevent us from doing good investigative journalism. And it hasn't so far.
You've talked about how this is your last court-approved trip before your case is heard by the Supreme Court.
Before we file.
Before
yeah, it's an interim period, and always those cesuras when you walk into the next phase, it could be, you don't know what will happen next. So we file on October 25. So I'm in between everything doing, I'm on with lawyers. Okay, so what are we doing?
Right. you're always thinking about that.
I think there are times I've spent 90% of my time with lawyers. And there are days, there's Sundays where we're sitting around a table and there's 24 lawyers around there, and I feel bad for me and I feel bad for them because it's hard. Rule of law is elusive. You have it, don't lose it, But I think the challenge we all face is that impunity online is impunity offline. And if you get away with attacking someone online, then what's the difference, right? Virtual world and the real world, we are only one human being in both. So this is that impunity, whether it's attacks against women, gender disinformation, or information warfare, Russia, Ukraine, or information operations, the attacks against journalists in the Philippines. And they're not just from my government, right? In September 2020, Facebook took down information operations from China that were attacking me and Rappler, but it was also creating fake accounts for the US presidential elections, and it was already campaigning for Marcos and Duterte, the daughter. So these networks are the same. Okay, so having said that, sorry, let me answer your question. I lived and worked in the golden age of journalism, and this is not it. In the Nobel lecture, I talked about the atom bomb that exploded. And when the atom bomb exploded and 140,000 people were killed instantaneously, the world woke up. I think I'm here to try to wake you up and to not just tell you the problem, but also the solutions. Because we are going to have to create what this future is going to look like, what our present is going to look like.
So I want to talk about the atomic bomb that you just talked about. Let's talk about democracy particularly. We live in an age right now where democracy is under threat, both online and offline. You have talked about 2024 being a turning point for the world, a tipping point. You said it could mean the end of democracy, that we would have enough illiberal governments elected globally for democracy to be on the brink of collapse. Can you tell us exactly what you mean by that, and can you expand for us on that?
Yeah. No, thank you for asking. I mean, again, I sound like I hate technology, but I was the truest of true believers in Facebook when we started Rappler. In fact, we started Rappler on Facebook as a Facebook page, and if search had been better, maybe we wouldn't have built the website. So it's 2 points, right? The first is the changing incentive structure that now governs our societies, that is determined by social media, by the technology companies, and then how that has created a system that now has shifted democracy globally, geopolitically. So what do I mean by that? Well, you hear the subway beneath us, right? Like, this was like 6 years ago. The ground was shaking under our feet in 2016. We didn't pay attention to it, but the actual information operations began in 2014. Russia was testing, and it was the meta-narratives that were seeded against Crimea, right? The Nazification, those same meta-narratives where they then annexed Crimea, then were used in 2022 to take over, to go to war with Ukraine, to get Ukraine itself. That's the conventional warfare. Facts are now debatable. No, not you, you're younger than me, but you still have CBC. I mean, this is what Canada has over other democratic nations. I just found out from Michael, your median age is 44 years old, which means you haven't adapted. While you're on social media, it's not like the Philippines, where Filipinos have spent the most time online and on social media globally for 6 years, right? Our median age is 23 years old. And so this generational change is pivotal. So let me describe the problem and how social media became a behavior modification system. When lies spread faster than facts, right? And why do lies spread faster? Because the goal is to use your biology to keep you scrolling. That was the first goal. It changed in 2018 after Cambridge Analytica. But how do they keep you scrolling? They use our emotions, so, you know, triggering your emotions, that then changes, makes you, what are the emotions that are triggered? Fear, anger, hate. And you keep scrolling, you get angry, you dive deeper, right? But when that happens, it became easier for geopolitical power to dive in, and then this is the how do you get online attacks. The online attacks I received were meant to pound me to silence. Imagine that, you know, 1,000,000 times I get Maria Ressa is a liar, a liar, a liar, a liar. Only the target sees all of that, because we all have different feeds. You see bits and pieces. And our biology is such that, like, if you hear it from different places, you'll begin to think it's true. A lie said 1,000,000 times becomes a fact. Okay, so that's the incentive structure. What else do they build in? Not only do you become angrier, but it's the algorithms of amplification, right? A lie spreads faster and further than a fact. Facts are really boring. We spend our careers trying to make them interesting, to catch your attention. So here, in 2018, MIT said that a lie spreads at least 6 times faster than a fact. Now we have this. All right, so now we have information operations, then you have geopolitical. 3 ways you're affected at the individual level, that's psychologically, right? Your emotions changes your view of the world. Think January 6th. The people who went to Capitol Hill believed. And then the next phase from personal, from psychological, is sociological. We behave differently in groups. And then the last one is something that only technology enabled right now, which is emergent human behavior. Okay, emergent human behavior today is anger and hate. The reward structure actually rewards hate. Are you surprised that the world has shifted? Okay, so then connects to democracy. Sorry, let me, I can talk about this forever. So, if you don't have integrity of facts, you can't have integrity of elections. How do you know whom to vote for? In America, we know, and it's clearly documented, that Russian disinformation hit both sides of Black Lives Matter. They didn't care about whether you took one side or the other. What they cared about is that you believed neither and you were angry. Identity politics and all, right? And so once we have these elections, and this year there are 30 plus key elections. The Philippines was May 9th this year. You know what happened? Our history was literally changed in front of our eyes. Ferdinand Marcos, our dictator who was ousted in a people power revolt in 1986, his son and namesake won overwhelmingly, largely with the use of information operations that began in 2014. 2014 is a key year, where his Marcos changed from a pariah to a hero. And if you go to the poorer neighborhoods in the Philippines, you ask them, why are you voting for Marcos? They'll say, because I'm gonna get the Marcos gold. I said, and then you ask them, why? What do you mean? That's what YouTube said. So Bolsonaro was a far-right fringe figure until YouTube brought him to the mainstream, right? So these things that used to be conspiracy theories, or like I'd say, it's like the things your crazy neighbor said that you kind of talk about, because this isn't a free speech issue, it's never made it to mainstream. But imagine if your crazy neighbor's conspiracy theory all of a sudden became the headline of CBC. That's kind of what social media did. Last 2 minutes of democracy, because this year, key elections in different parts of the world. Kenya has had elections, French elections. You see the rise of the right in Europe. Sweden, Italy, Nazi Germany coming, sorry if you're, but it's, the right is rising, we're shifting. We have Brazil's runoff is October 30th, and then the midterms in the US. Next year, Nigeria, Turkey, you have African elections, the beginning of Indian elections, 2024, the red letter year. Indonesia, the world's largest Muslim population. The front runner is Prabowo, the son-in-law of former President Suharto. I covered the end of almost 32 years of Suharto's rule. He's the front runner. And you have India, world's largest democracy, social media and information operations turning truth upside down, and then finally the United States. By 2024, if we don't change anything drastically in the way our information ecosystem works, we will elect enough illiberal leaders democratically. They will then, like Duterte did, crumble the institutions of democracy from within and form global alliances. And I'm sorry, I'm going to end the doomsday scenario. And you know, it's really not a doomsday scenario. I guess we lay it out because we counted the number of democracies. There are now more people living in authoritarian countries, under authoritarian rule, than under democratic rule globally. We are rolled back to democracy, the number of democracies 15 years ago. And by 2024, that tipping point happens, and we're seeing it now. I don't know if you've seen, like, there's a group called, it's set up by China and Russia. It's called the Shanghai Cooperation Union. And it is, it's an economic grouping using technology for development. And who just joined them in September? Iran, Turkey, Myanmar. And the Western countries, Western democracies, democratic nations, are slow. There is one upside, right? I mean, Ukraine galvanized the world. I just came from Brussels, and one of the questions I was asked by some of the folks there was, you know, did we do the right thing in banning RT and Sputnik? Do you think they did the right thing? Yes? Anyone say no? I said, what took you so long? Right? I mean, think about it. Part of the reason people don't know, can't separate fact from fiction, is because lies are at the speed of light while facts don't travel. And then the second part is authorities don't speak. So yes, we must, this flattening of meaning that social media has done, right? And this happens in race, in identity. Our identities are being used and manipulated against us. This is insidious manipulation. I'll end this long rant, because it does connect, right? So social media to geopolitical power. It is one strand, because we are all citizens. We've forgotten we're citizens, and we've become users or consumers, kind of sitting back. But we live in an age where we need to act like citizens again, or we will lose these values that have, I mean, you know, we once thought democracy was unstoppable. That's certainly not true today.
So let me talk to you about disinformation and how you've laid out to us very clearly that disinformation is at the core of what you've called the pollution of the information ecosystem, and that has an impact on democracy. And in fact, you've said that democracy dies by 1,000 cuts. Tell us exactly at the brink of what we are at right now, particularly in relations to Canada. I think Canada is doing, in many ways, quite well compared to the cases that you've laid out for us. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Death by 1,000 cuts is a phrase from Al-Qaeda, not Taylor Swift. My rapper said Taylor Swift, 1,000 cuts. You know, I was like, no, it's AQAP, it's Al-Qaeda, it's death by 1,000 cuts. And it was at a time when I was grappling for words of how to describe it, because we needed new words, right? Shoshana Zuboff didn't coin the term surveillance capitalism. Her book didn't come out till 2019. We started living through this in 2014, and the political dominoes began to fall in 2016. So 1,000 cuts was like, I started feeling it, you know? It's like you cut, you're bleeding from every cut, and each cut isn't a death blow, because there's no one that, it's not like the old style coup anymore, right? This is cut, until the point that you're just bleeding to death, and yet you don't know it. Madeleine Albright called it something different in her book on fascism. She said, what's happening today is like plucking a chicken one feather at a time. Or another thing, because we had this whole thing about fascism. I was asking her, aren't you like over the top on when you say fascism? And then she said, it's like slicing a salami until it's almost done. Plucking a chicken feather by feather. Death by 1,000 cuts. Okay, so this is what we're already seeing, right? And then the reason I said that an atom bomb exploded in our information ecosystem is it is the death of our minds. There's the conventional war, Ukraine, Russia. That war is going on, right? And we're afraid of World War III. But World War III today is individual. That was what I said in the Nobel lecture. This is an individual battle for integrity. It is an individual battle for our values. That is what the information ecosystem has done. Remember, the tech people will tell you, we have personalized feeds. We don't have personalized feeds. We all live in one public sphere, and no one is protecting the public sphere. So we're here, death by 1,000 cuts. Canada is better, and I would nudge you. Because you're better, because you're not quite fainting from lack of blood. Although if you don't do much right now, you will, right? You can see the impact on a country as strong as, you know, what we once thought was the beacon of democracy, and we saw what happened in the United States. Here in Canada, I think part of the reason is CBC is super strong. Like, median age is 44 years old. I'm getting a lot out of that figure, Michael, you know, and you believe you still have a shared reality. You know, I forget the three sentences I've said repeatedly over and over and over. Without facts, you can't have truth. Without truth, you can't have trust. Without these three, we don't have a shared reality. We cannot solve any of the existential problems we face, including the virus, climate change. We cannot have democracy. I feel sorry for governments who are actually trying to govern, right? Because it's splintering us. It's not all doom and gloom. I guess Canada. I go back to Canada. Canada is a leader in the global media freedom coalition and remains so. Journalists are the punching bag of information operations. We have no defense except to just keep getting punched. This is why I just kind of, you know, it's like pollution. We have to absorb the blows. Like, what do you do when you get the attacks?
Well, that's a great question. As you know, when you get attacks online, it does take a bit of a toll, and you stop, right? But at the same time, you realize how important your work is. And so for me, what I do, I absorb. I've had to absorb for years and years and years because I believe in the importance of my job and in its core values and how it impacts Canadian democracy.
So you came out stronger, but you know, when I was your age, when Kim, I'm looking at, when we were your age as journalists, we didn't have to deal with that, right? In fact, our organization shielded us from things like this so that we could objectively tell you the story. You come to this, but there are many more, especially women, who have decided to opt out. And it's not just journalism, it's also politicians. Canada has strong female politicians, right? So I guess the world is transforming bit by bit. Canada has somehow held on to its strength. You cannot be left alone while you still have strength. Pull these countries together. And it may seem like what's happening in the Philippines is very far away, but since you're here, you believe that they're connected. But you know, in 2016, in California, I said, what is happening to us is coming for you. And it did. You know, January 6th was not a surprise. I thought that was just Silicon Valley sins coming home to roost. And still not enough has been done. We need to stop the impunity online.
That's such an important point. And in fact, you've even called Facebook a frenemy. What would a multilateral action look like on the world stage right now against the information pollution of, you know, the pollution of the information ecosystem, against this spreading of disinformation and how it impacts our democracies?
We actually, in September, Dmitry Muratov and I led about a dozen Nobel laureates and then about 100 different groups looking at this issue, including tech groups. And we came out with what we call this 10-point action plan. It's kind of like a constitution. And those 10 points, it didn't really address the United States, because the US has to get its act together, right? But there's one line for democracies, then a big chunk for the EU, since they were ahead in terms of putting together the Digital Services Act. They were ahead in terms of realizing we're not talking content, we're talking algorithms, data, and technology, right? And then the last part of it was really for individuals, for civil society. 3 buckets. The first is stop surveillance for profit. That's the core, and I'll explain that. I'll explain that better. The second is stop coded bias. Technology, because of the way they've recreated, because of the way they've created the virtual world, if you were marginalized in the physical world, you were further marginalized online. So I use coded bias all the time. This is a film, you can look at it. A woman from Nigeria, her name was Joy. She was a student at MIT, and she had an assignment to do an AI exercise. Except when she turned on her computer to do the exercise, the AI couldn't recognize her face. She's a black Nigerian woman, you know, she's a woman. So she changed her face and she put a white mask on, and then she was able to be recognized by the AI. The third part, so stop the coded bias. The third part is journalism as an antidote to tyranny. This is what's happening is, I think, journalists all around the world, we see the dam coming down, and we're trying to put a finger in the hole. That's the other way it feels every day. You know, is that enough? Is it gonna fall? But it needs a whole of society approach. Because in the end, if you look at solutions, education is the long-term solution. I worry about the kids today. The medium term is legislation, and the short term is civic engagement. It is trying to figure out, what does being a citizen mean when we are attacked individually, when our most vulnerable moments to a message, when we are micro-targeted. And you don't even know whether you're being micro-targeted by Russia or Iran or China, right? I'll say one last thing before.
Yeah.
How does it work, this micro-targeting, right? Because I sound like a doomsday machine, but I will tell you, I will tweet after this every single, different articles that will be backed with data. Every time you go on your phone, you go on one of these platforms, it collects your atomized actions, right? So if I'm on Facebook and I'm gonna post our photo here, right? Machine learning will come in and create a model of you. It will create a model of you that knows you better than you know yourself, because it takes it up over time. So that model, get rid of the word model and call it a clone. So you're cloned. then these companies say, because we used machine learning to clone you, we got your thoughts, your feelings, your weaknesses, we own the clone. And then artificial intelligence comes in, scoops up all of our clones, and pushes it upstream. This is where the real problem is and where legislation should target, not downstream, which is content, right? So upstream, what is this? This is all of our data, all of our clones, that are then served. This is called micro-targeting. Your weakest moment, your most vulnerable moment to a message, that now is computationally generated, is then served to you right when you are more prone to accept it. So if you're angry because you're getting served content, algorithmic, like how all of this works still is about you and your clone. So that's the insidious manipulation I talk about. And then the one last thing I think which you need to see this is, what's polarization and echo chambers? People talk about this all the time, right? That we're polarized and we're in echo chambers. And then journalists actually always say, so how can we heal that? For journalists, we really can't, because this is the way it worked, right? And I saw this with data. I lived through it in the Philippines. In 2016, Filipinos were in the center. We did not debate facts. We all agreed we're in an auditorium, so here. But in 2016, reality began to splinter. Because remember the political dominoes, right? Duterte was elected in 2016. About a month later, that was May, Brexit happened, and then all the elections that then led to Donald Trump, so on. Then Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro was a year later, Macron, Facebook actually took down 30,000 fake accounts in time for Macron's elections. Okay, so what happens? How does Facebook or social media grow? They use an algorithm called friends of friends. And this is A/B tested. So they figured out that in our biology, if it's a friend of a friend, we're more prone to grow our networks. And when we grow our networks, they grow the platform. So in 2016, friends of friends, this is what happened. Can you hold my mic for me?
Yes.
Okay, so this is what happened, right? Center. And then in 2016, friends of friends, if you're pro-Duterte or pro-Trump or whatever pro, you move further right. If you're anti-Duterte, you move further left. That's 2016, 2017, 2018, we're 2022. The more time you allow this to happen, the more splintered our reality gets. And then the last part is, how do you go down the rabbit hole, right? And if you have young sons, I spoke to a couple on the way in, they target them, right? Like I have a friend who has a 12-year-old son, and her son gets targeted with white replacement theory content. Right? So this is not one of those things where you go out there and you look for the conspiracy theories. They come looking for you because you become more engaged. Sorry, this is, you just have to see the way it connects and how the algorithms work. But I will tweet the data for you.
This is so important, Maria, the way that you are laying it out for us in our country right now. And in the world. I want to talk about journalism in this configuration because facts are at the core of the conversation, as you've said. What kind of journalism, perhaps before we even talk about what kind of journalism, what is at stake for journalism right now in this context that you've laid down for us?
Everything is at stake, right? Because the incentive structure of our distribution platforms actually is degrading quality journalism, right? Think about it, right? We've commoditized journalism because how do we decide whether a story is good? How many clicks? I mean, are you surprised it's clickbaity, right? And then when you do that, I know this from running Rappler. So let me put it to you this way with the data. Yeah. This is the same for any news group in the world, right? We spent 6 months on an investigative piece. Got lots of facts, and it is about corruption. We exposed, one of the pieces exposed the largest corruption scandal during COVID-19, where a colleague, somebody who, a special advisor to President Duterte, was connected to the company that was like all of 19 months old that corralled all of the largest COVID accounts. No distribution, right? Like our drug war series, we called it the impunity series, won lots of awards, but online, you actually have to read the stories. But what does get a lot of distribution? Crime, entertainment. This has always been the case. That was always, I ran the largest television broadcasting network, the news group, and I know that if we wanted ratings, it would be crime and entertainment. But because we're journalists, we cannot feed our people, our citizens, and our next generation only crime and entertainment. It would make us the most money, we would get the most ratings, but we would have really dumb citizens. So, as editors, we actually would spend money on stories that cost us, like down the conflict in southern Mindanao, where we would need to send a flyaway. CBC does all of this. Why would you go to Ukraine, right? Because you need to be there, because you need to do the stories. That costs money. So this is what's happened now is you have all of the sugar without any of the vegetables. And that's how we become as citizens. So back to the kind of I'll give you a very concrete example of what the platforms degraded journalism. Aside from page views and the kind of pennies that you get from a page, Facebook at one point said, our focus is on video. People will watch more video. And then they started rolling out numbers. People were watching more video on Facebook. So then what did the news groups do? They laid off reporters who weren't doing video, and then they staffed up their video team. And then like 2 years later, Facebook said, oh, our numbers were inflated 90%. Those people have lost their jobs, right? So I worry about this. The incentive structure is wrong, but it's not just journalism, right? Think about the incentive structure. If you're rewarded when you lie, what incentive structure do we have?
Let's talk a little bit about attacks against journalists. You are the front line of this globally.
You keep reminding me.
So sorry about that. But I think you and I connect on that because in our country, I'm also at the front line of this. And you've talked about gendered disinformation particularly. And in Canada, women journalists, particularly women of color journalists, are being viciously attacked online. Why are women and women of color at the front line of the attacks on freedom of speech?
Oh my gosh, so remember the old world system was name and shame, right? Name and shame. And so if you were slightly racist, and sometimes was also generational in the Philippines, for example. Like President Duterte's generation, they grew up this way. So in some ways, I'm a little forgiving. It was a cultural thing. They were slightly sexist, and well, President Duterte went into misogynist. But so the world began to shift, and it's at the pace of human change. Women gained their rights, right? We were able to speak for ourselves. But when we came under attack, and this is what's happening online, when you inflame people, when you make them afraid, let's talk United States, right? The demographic changes in the United States were reported on, and then young white men or white men began feeling afraid. We're seeing a rise. Hungary has put into state ideology white replacement theory, right? Us against them, like the worst of what Nazi Germany did. We've been through this before. Let me go back to women, LGBTQ, women of color. I actually Wana Foundation, which is a Canadian foundation. We were talking about women of color, and they came up with a better phrase. women of the global majority. Pretty good, right? I guess the way the coded bias works is that if you were marginalized before, you're further marginalized. When the fear is awakened and it becomes an us against them, when identity politics is weaponized, the goal is not actually to, support one side or another. The goal is to make everyone so confused that they do not trust anything. This is warfare. It's information warfare, right? So, sorry, let me give you some statistics, because I can talk about this forever as well. Those are the things that I think give me a very clear perspective. I run the business of Rappler. I build tech for Rappler. And so I understand also how the tech guys work, which is it's a 2-week agile development, meaning you have to prioritize. If you don't have any values, you're not going to prioritize safety. Sorry, tech, if you're here. Anyway, and then the third part is I'm also the target of attack. And only the target of attack sees all the attacks. You see bits and pieces if you're seeing it, right? So for women, the UNESCO and the International Center for Journalists actually did the first big data case study of attacks against women journalists. And the statistics are chilling because we had data, because I've been pulling together. When we did our series, our investigative series on the weaponization of the internet, I was getting an average of 90, you've heard this, 90 hate messages per hour, right? 90, who gets that? Like, I was getting, but see, I think I'm even a little bit better than you are in the sense that I was old enough to have had a full career when I was clobbered with 90 hate messages per hour. For our young reporters who were in their early 20s, I worried about them, right? So what they did is they took almost 500,000 social media attacks, hate messages, and they classified them. They used natural language processing, and then here's the classification for me. 60% of the attacks were meant to tear down my credibility. It's a world without trust, right? 40% were meant to tear down my spirit, right? And they're nasty little things. Like, I would wake up and I have dry skin, I have eczema, and at one point, I guess, because they couldn't find anything. I'm not corrupt, so you can't find anything. I've done my journalism for a very long time. I don't scare that easily. And so they started looking at how I sounded. They started making fun of me. That's tough. And then the last part is, because I have dry skin and I was still going strong, they were like, okay. So they started putting more, making my face look really uglier, and they started calling me scrotum face. And then they would take my head and post it on top of male human genitals. I don't even know what to call it, scrotum face. That's the easiest, they do get it, right? You wake up with this and you just go, maybe for 2 weeks, it sets you back. Like you said, you should tell me. Like for me, it was like, okay. And then I just it's a switch. Nietzsche was right. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Okay, I have eczema. So I can tell you now. Before I might have been ashamed to tell you I have eczema. So, and we keep going.
What does journalism for the 21st century look like?
Oh my Lord. What does journalism for the 20th? Depends on how quickly you act, right? So there's still the CBC, and I'm so glad, to see The Nation, to see Adrian Arson, to see the journalism, the standards and ethics. That's critical, right? Because if we need to put standards and ethics in tech, the tech that rules our minds. Sorry, I'll say one last thing, right? So I was talking about conventional war. World War III is individual. It is in each of our minds. So do not lose your war, right? So what does journalism look like in an age of distrust?
That's right.
I think it's a whole of society approach. The journalists can't do this alone, right? We need to keep doing our jobs. Our job is to hold power to account. I was joking backstage. I was like, why are we so foolish that we challenge power? Why do we do this? But that's our task. And part of the reason we do that is for you. But today's generation, the young kids, I worry about what happens when they're on social media living performative lives on platforms that don't care whether they grow into good, smart people, right? And what is it? The things that they used to do with their family and friends in the real world, instead of like trying out new words or new identities or new clothes with your close family and friends, where your mom will tell you, that's really kind of ugly, you should change that. But it's said with love, it's very different. Or, that's fantastic. And identity is built iteratively, right? We help each other. On social media now, our kids are trying things out, they're curating their lives, they're performing instead of learning, and they're doing it for popularity. I hated high school,
Mm-hmm.
So when they do it for popularity, it's not just that. This group, the crowd that they are playing to, can turn into a mob like this. And it has. And that's part of the reason you see the dystopia in our young women, for example. Frances Haugen came out with the internal documents of Facebook that said women were getting anorexia. There were higher incidents of suicide. The dystopia is really clear. So we need to put it together in the context of technology, because we still look at them. The old world problems haven't changed. They're still there. There is racism, but for a period of time, we made headway, and Canada's so inclusive. It was name and shame when you were not. Social media now has turned that upside down, and we have lost so much ground. I worry about that. Again, sorry, I worry about a lot of things.
So this profit agenda from these social media companies has, as you've pointed out in your work, also undermined elections, including in your country. And you've talked to us about the importance of fact-based journalism. What's the role of journalism in educating people and audiences, the public, in the age of disinformation?
Oh my gosh. So this is part of what I tackled in my book that's coming out in November. It's called,
Yeah, I'm excited for that.
It's How to Stand Up to a Dictator, but replace the word dictator with bully, right? So how to stand up to a dictator. The role of journalism in all of this, I still think we're like a skeleton, but it will depend on the people. Sorry, I talked about a whole of society approach, right? And we tested this in the Philippines for our elections. And what we found was journalists alone, we did a 4-layer pyramid. We called it Facts First PH. I'll tweet this as well. 16 news organizations working together. We never worked together like this before. Fact checks. Fact checks are really boring. It's like the most boring job. Like, we assume when we do a report that you check the facts. That's like oxygen, right? But here we are, because the distribution platforms have made facts debatable, we have to do fact checks. They should be doing fact checks. So here we are, we do that. They don't spread on social media. So the second layer is called the mesh. That is the layer of almost 100 civil society groups, NGOs, environmental groups, because the disinformation is across everything, business and the church. And what they do is their task is to spread the fact checks, share the fact checks with emotion, right? Because what's our world? Our world today, there's this the crisis we face today, and this is E.O. Wilson's quote. He's a biologist who studies emergent behavior in ants. Emergent behavior is like the way the whole group behaves that you can't predict from individual parts. So in ants, you know how they build the anthill, right? In humans, he said that the greatest crisis we face is our Paleolithic emotions, our medieval institutions, and our godlike technology, right? So that's core. What else are we going to do? News organizations, our business model crumbled because we don't micro-target. We don't insidiously manipulate you, right? And so we now have to find a business model to tell you the truth, the facts, and to hold power to account. It's like we just keep beating ourselves up. Sorry, let me finish the pyramid. The third layer are academics. These are disinformation researchers. And this we got from the Election Integrity Partnership of the United States. Every week in the last 3 months before elections, we had academic groups who had data that was filtered through our pyramid that then told the Filipino people how they were being manipulated, who was manipulating, what were the meta-narratives saying, and who was benefiting and who was targeted. It was very clear the entire time. Marcos was benefiting. Leni Robredo was always the target. And finally, the last top of the pyramid is the most important one. There were our lawyers, legal groups, the Free Legal Association of the Philippines, the Philippine Bar Association, the Integrated Bar of the Philippines. They filed, again, when you don't have rule of law, reminding people there is rule of law, because this is a very harmful feedback loop. So they filed in the last 3 months, at least 21 cases, tactical and strategic, to help bring rule of law back. You're not at that stage in Canada yet. You must act before you get there. Hopefully you never get there, because I think you have a global role to play. Our countries in the global south have fallen off the cliff. And when that happens, you don't want to get dragged down. You want to drag us up.
What's the role for everyday Canadians? What does a person-to-person defense of democracy look like?
I love that question. Thank you. Distrust anger if you're on social media, right? If you're angry, don't share. Just take 2 seconds to step back. You have a government that works. Although you also had truckers who were manipulated. I've seen it in Canada and in France. I was in France during the Yellow Vest protests. And it's the same thing. Where did that spread? On social media, right? And do you need to raise fuel taxes? Yes. So how do you actually get people to understand? Where does collective good come in? These are all questions, and you're still strong enough to actually handle them, but you will see the rise of these forces. You still have cracks. You have cracks, not chasms. We did a social media scan of the United States right before and right after Roe v. Wade. And it was worse than the Philippines. I mean, before the election of Marcos. And what we saw was a direct link after Roe v. Wade to Kenya elections, right? And so we do live in a global world. Please understand you are being, no matter how smart you are, in fact, the smarter you are sometimes, the easier to manipulate your emotions. Be careful. The insidious manipulation is there. This is a behavior modification system. So be aware, look for the facts. Number 2, start in the real world. 2 instances of light that happened February this year. A little-known comic president decided not to leave his country for safety in the United States. He decided to fight in Ukraine, and because Zelensky did that, his people were inspired, and they inspired the rest of the world. It was the first movement of democratic states. Right? Yes, clap for it. Simultaneously, on almost the same day, it was February 24, in our run-up to our elections, the vice president, a woman, Leni Robredo, talented lawyer, she began, their campaign at that point had decided disinformation was too much. So they started going door to door. Never been done in the Philippines because we don't go door to door. It's feudal, patronage-driven politics, right? So they started going door to door. Then all of a sudden, around February 24, she started getting hundreds of thousands of people coming to her campaign rallies. And then what we began to see, and here's the emotion that will beat hate: inspiration, love, that fudgy word. There's so much we do for each other, our families, that isn't quantified in economics, not in power or money, right? So how do we bring that back? These are questions that I struggle with, but those are hopes, patches of light for me. And I feel like you have them. You have a lot more of them. Don't let them go to waste.
How can people support you and your organization?
If something really bad happens, please make noise. How can we? I think first support independent journalism, right? Like, because we're struggling, and it's not just me. I decided to co-chair the International Fund for Public Interest Media, where we're actually trying to get Overseas Development Assistance Fund increased from 0.3% to 1% so that we could help independent news groups survive in our countries. I will say please join Rappler Plus. So here's what happened. How did we survive 6 years of Duterte? Our lawyers weren't sure we would, right? Everybody told me, everyone said, you're crazy. But it was, when President Duterte attacked us, I was already old enough to have a very strong sense. I mean, I had become a journalist 3 decades earlier. I had helped write 4 standards and ethics manual. So it wasn't a thought. My co-founders and I just did the right thing every time, right? And everyone kept saying the incentive structure is to do the wrong thing, right? Coerce, co-opt, corrupt. Corrupt, coerce, co-opt. The 3 C's were the ones. That was how our society was working. In the when the Nobel came, all of a sudden it was like this big beacon that said, doing the right thing is the right thing. So, how do you help us? We couldn't have survived without our own community in the Philippines helping us. Our legal fees went from 0 to 1/3 of our monthly operating expenses. And so we have Rappler Plus. If you want to know more about the Philippines, you'll get it from us. But then the other part is our international legal team. So many people just helped us. Like, Covington Burling, which is a huge Washington, D.C. law firm, right? I had a classmate, graduated with me. He just said, we're helping you pro bono. I said, really? And really, they're helping pro bono. Amal Clooney, George Clooney involved. He's really cute. I cannot repay all of these. So the fact that you're here, the fact that you will work for your democracy, those are all things that help us.
Maria, you are a beacon of light. You are, in many ways, the ultimate journalist because you stand for truth and democracy, and you tell the truth. So thank you so very much for being with us tonight, for telling us what we need to fight for in our country and globally. It is a huge service you've done to us. It is now time for questions. So there are 2 mics, one over there, one over there. So please line up for your questions. That would be the best way for us going forward. Did you have a question, sir? Could you please?
I can give him a mic. You want me to give him?
I think we might need.
Thank you,
please
Maria.
line up. Thank you. No, that's good. That's good.
Every time I listen to you, you make more sense. My name is Lutfullah. I'm a journalist from Afghanistan. And I have a lot of admiration for you, and thank you for your time. We had the freest press in Afghanistan before return of the Taliban. So Taliban came, we fell from 122 on the World Press Freedom Index to 156 in just 12 months. And citizen journalism, that we didn't talk much tonight, is becoming mainstream. So Afghan people are protecting democracy. They're sending information. And I see that media is relying so much on citizen journalism. The question is, how safe is that? How journalistic is that to rely, let's say, solely on citizen journalism when you don't have enough access to information in a society like ours? Thank you, and thank you for the mic.
Important question.
I mean, micro and macro, right? So I'll do macro first. I think every time democratic states don't live according to their values, we all take a little bit of a body blow. So Syria, Afghanistan is part of it. The UN needs to kind of, this was not for you, UN needs to find its balls. You know, it's like, it really has to, but of course we know the way it's set up, right? And no, yeah, so I would love to hear what you think. So at the macro level, I think part of these things have happened because they're cascading failures. It's a value system, right? But the second thing is, at a micro level, citizen journalism is never sustainable because those people are normal people without the benefit of training of, and I don't mean training of journalism, I mean training of safety, right? Like, we did, when I was heading the largest network, the news network in the Philippines, we did a tipping point. We found a tipping point because participatory media was what I experimented in when I headed the largest network, because we used it to call you out to action, right? And in the Ampatuan massacre in 2009, 58 journalists were killed. It was the largest election-related violence globally. That's CPJ's, the Committee to Protect Journalists, saying that. The person who sent us the photo, so we had a citizen journalist who emailed 3 things to us. First, a description of people being killed and a backhoe digging. The second was who did it, the Ampatuan. The third was a photo. ABS-CBN was the network I was leading then. We didn't publish the photo yet, because we needed to check that in the caravan of these journalists that there was a white Toyota Hiace van. But I was pretty certain that that was sent by a soldier, because they were the only ones who were allowed on the site. So citizen journalists, in the best of all worlds, are like whistleblowers in, but that is at a time when there's some kind of structure and system. In Afghanistan, in Russia, think about this right now, right? Most of the news groups have now left. Novaya Gazeta, Dmitry Muratov's news organization, is not operating in Russia anymore, and Moscow. This is the reason why I don't want to operate outside of the Philippines, because we should, maybe this is outdated, but our risks are ours. And sometimes when it gets too much, you do have to pull out, but then how do we protect those citizen journalists? You can see I'm conflicted in this. I don't think it's sustainable at all. And that goes back to the macro level, right? Like, what are the global institutions of democratic states that can help prevent what the Taliban has done? You're not even really high on the list of things that we're doing. But right? But the people feel it. So these are some of the problems that we have. And this is death by 1,000 cuts, right? Syria, plop, 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 in every single one. But all of them go back to what are the key values that we hold. Sorry, it's a long answer to a tough question. I think citizen journalists are add-ons, and I think to really deploy them, we need to train them in safety.
Safety is huge. On the left, please.
Hi there. My name is Noah Khan. I'm a junior fellow at Massey College, and I was wondering, you were mentioning what an individual defense of democracy looks like, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on what that might look like in a conversation with someone who might be disenchanted with democracy. So what do you say to that person who believes in the gold from the YouTube videos?
Oh, wow, what a fantastic question.
Absolutely.
So the perfect storm in the Philippines, I'll describe the Philippines and you'll pull out your strand, right? The perfect storm in the Philippines that elected Duterte was the failure of the economic system to trickle down, right? So it's liberal democracy with the economic system that came with it, right? So there was this, the trickle-down effect didn't trickle down. The second was the rise of social media. The third was the lack of effective communications, a leader leading. These times demand leadership, not just from governments, but look at those Silicon Valley companies. We demand leadership, but that always happens in pivotal moments of history, right? So, let me put it in the context of my family. My parents live in Florida. You know, the way Florida voted. My own family is divided between, you know, some of my family voted for Trump, some of my family, like my sister works for Planned Parenthood in LA, right? So how do you talk to your family? With love, you know, and you talk about, because in the end you know each other really well, and we're not on social media, and we must be talking to each other because that's where it begins. The second level, though, is how do we address these key problems of macroeconomics that haven't worked, right? Of how did the 1%, remember 99%, 1% was the WTO. It was in Seattle in 1999, right? These are still issues that are there. Is there a new one? Are we even talking about universal basic income, right? Like, this is, and here's where I've sounded like doomsday. The reason I get really excited is I think this is a time of creation. This is what we're doing in Rappler. We're building tech to have a safe space for democratic discourse, right? Where you can actually say whatever you want, but you need to listen. And governments, this is like a wonderful time to be creative. Estonia had one of their, Thomas Eves, so we sit together on the Internet Governance Forum, but one of the things he's really concerned about is how your data is protected from governments, right? So in Estonia, everything is already digitized, and if a police officer looks at your license, you're notified, right? That's kind of cool. How many of us, this is the age of massive, it's, in financial terms, creative destruction. The old world is destroyed. It's just deceptively familiar. But we need to build a new, better one. And I think we might have the opportunity to build something better.
That's very uplifting. Thank you. On the right, please.
Hi, Maria. Thank you for that talk. I was really interested in the way you've laid out how you're fighting in the trenches online. How do you fight disinformation? You have this pyramid. You do the fact checks. You get the groups promoting the fact checks. And then at the end you got your lawyers suing the government. And just seeing like a coordinated, like literally fighting these cuts by 1,000 knives with your own, I suppose, approach, right? But one of the things I didn't hear you address, and I guess you flicked at it a couple times, and I was hoping you'd be able to expand on it, is the other half of the equation, which is sort of the responsibility of the platforms themselves. And you know, there has been a lot of talk around the old system was based around publishers' responsibility and the idea that you publish something, you own it, and you might be sued for it, and you might lose your shirt over it. And that principle seemed to work pretty well. Maybe not perfectly, but it did sort of afford a measure of accountability that is totally gone now.
Yeah.
Like Mark Zuckerberg he doesn't care what you put on Facebook. And so I'm wondering, what credence do you pay to the idea that there is even a possibility of accountability at the platform level?
Thank you for the question, and I'm so sorry that I haven't addressed it directly, because I believe a lot of these things are criminal in the physical world and should be criminal in the virtual world. I sound like a rightist, right? So let me put it this way. Right now in America, they treat 4 strands, and I think Canada's done a little bit better than America on this. Your new legislation that's coming up is actually one of the best, I think, right? So in America, they treat data privacy, antitrust, user safety, And content moderation is 4 different things, but they're all the same things. They're connected to surveillance capitalism, to the ownership of our data, right? The clones. So the reason why I've actually said, like, let's end this, and let me quote Shoshana Zuboff, who compared this, this behavior system where they essentially created a market of behavioral predictions. And what they did here, she compared it to the slave market. And she said it should be outlawed. We picked up something, like surveillance for profit, because surveillance for profit also can be the surveillance of your hardware, predator, right? Surveillance, because governments use this as well. So that's the first is surveillance capitalism is inherently, what's the right word? Exploitative. It's inherently exploitative and goes against the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So my question is, why is it allowed? I'll give you one reason why. $70 million is spent in lobbying so that we're talking about content moderation, so that you think it's a free speech issue. It is not a free speech issue. You still have the right to say anything. You don't have the right to distribute hate, right? So this is, so for me, that's part of what we've been working on. And as the target of attack, I don't want to play whack-a-mole. Imagine, right? Like, you can't respond to every single nasty thing that comes your way. But what I want is to find a solution, an upstream solution, that gets rid of the cascading failure. So let's compare it to the 19th century, when the commodity then of the robber barons, remember Carnegie, Rockefeller, the commodity then was labor. What did they do? 24-hour sweatshops, child labor. And the government came up with laws to prevent that. Labor laws, right? The New Deal also came in, well, in and around that time, right? So when the commodity was labor, it was exploited, and then laws came in to fix it and protect us. What's the commodity today? Attention. It's attention, and it's our minds. That's the commodity. So do you want somebody playing with your minds? Why do we not look at code the way we look at building codes? This is Chris Wiley, the Cambridge Analytica whistleblower, right? He said, we should have building codes for tech. It should pass certain code restrictions. There's lots of different things. So I'll end with Canada's law, right? So there are 3 legislation that you're looking at that's interesting. One to help journalists, another on hate speech, and then the third one is, this algorithmic amplification, technology and data. I haven't finished going through all of it yet, but so far it hasn't fallen. I've testified a few times to your parliament, and it hasn't fallen into this abyss of content. The minute you start talking about censoring, or look at what Facebook did. They created what did they call it? The content, their Supreme Court. What is it? The Content Advisory Board, right? Oversight, Content Oversight Board, right? They called themselves the Content Oversight Board. And Mark Zuckerberg said it was the Supreme Court. I'm so sorry, but the lies come at the speed of light, and the Supreme Court works at the speed of, like, an ant? No, not even. Ants move faster, right? So it was the wrong solution to the wrong problem. I'm a member of the real Facebook Oversight Board that was created by Carol Cadwallader and Shoshana Zuboff. We came up with that precisely because the right things weren't being pushed. So the only thing I have appealed to enlightened self-interest for these platforms, because they literally have the power to stop it now. But they don't. So pressure them. They listen to Canadians more than they listen to Filipinos.
Thank you so very much. This has been an incredible night, Maria. I know there are more questions, but unfortunately this is the end of the night. And I will invite Madame Nathalie Desrosiers to say a few words for us.
Yes, I'm sorry for the people at the conversation that we want to continue at Massey College. And tonight, I just want to say merci beaucoup, Miigwech. Thank you so much, Maria, for coming back to Massey College. You've been really enlightening us and also inspiring us to continue to do good work. Merci, Omayra, and thank you, Michael, for being there. And thank you, all of you, for continuing the good fight. This is what we're all about here, is to continue to reflect on our responsibility as citizens and as people that want to support the good work of journalists throughout the world. Merci. Good night.